The morning fog hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Camilla Parker Bowles sat in her private study, staring at the official correspondence that had arrived with the dawn. The ornate letterhead of Buckingham Palace seemed to mock her as she read the words again, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. After years of carefully building her position within the royal family, everything she had worked for was crumbling beneath her feet. The letter was formal, clinical in its language, but the message was clear. The palace was implementing a new structure of responsibilities, and her role was being significantly reduced. Where once she had been consulted on matters of state protocol and charitable patronages, she now found herself relegated to ceremonial appearances and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The real power, the letter explained with bureaucratic politeness, would be consolidated under Prince William's expanding influence as the heir apparent took on greater responsibilities in preparation for his future reign. Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she set the document down on her mahogany desk. She had known this day might come, but the swiftness of it caught her off guard. Just weeks ago, she had been planning international visits and discussing policy initiatives with senior advisors. Now, those same advisors were being reassigned to William's rapidly growing team of supporters and strategists. The irony wasn't lost on her. For decades, she had been the outsider fighting to gain acceptance within the royal institution. She had weathered public scandals, media scrutiny, and the cold shoulders of family members who viewed her as an interloper. Through patience, dedication, and careful maneuvering, she had finally carved out a respected position for herself. She had proven her worth through countless charitable endeavors, diplomatic visits, and public appearances that gradually won over a skeptical public. But, now, as King Charles III's reign settled into its rhythm, the younger generation was asserting itself. William, with his natural charisma and popular appeal, was being positioned as the future of the monarchy. The palace machinery, always forward-thinking, was already shifting its focus to ensure a smooth transition when the time came. In this new landscape, Camilla found herself increasingly marginalized, despite her official title and years of service. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her study made her straighten in her chair. She quickly composed herself, smoothing her expression into the practiced neutrality that royal life demanded. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of her private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, a woman who had served the royal household for over 2 decades and had become one of Camilla's most trusted allies. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of concern that she couldn't quite hide. "I wanted to discuss the schedule changes that have been requested by the Palace Communications Office." Camilla gestured for her to sit in the leather chair across from her desk. Margaret's usually pristine appearance showed subtle signs of stress, a slight wrinkle in her typically immaculate jacket, a strand of graying hair that had escaped her usually perfect chignon. The changes weren't just affecting Camilla, they were rippling through her entire staff structure. "Show me," Camilla said simply, knowing that whatever Margaret had to report would likely confirm her worst fears about the extent of her diminished role. Margaret opened her leather portfolio and spread several documents across the desk. The papers outlined a comprehensive restructuring of royal duties and appearances. Event after event that had been on Camilla's calendar for months was now being transferred to other members of the royal family. High-profile charity galas, state dinner hosting duties, and international diplomatic receptions, all reassigned. The Commonwealth Literacy Foundation Gala next month, Margaret began, her finger tracing down a list of events. "Prince William will now be the keynote speaker instead of you. The cancer research fundraiser that you've championed for 3 years is being handed over to Princess Catherine. Even the garden party for military veterans that was supposed to be your signature event this season has been moved to Prince Edward's calendar." Each cancellation felt like a small death, a erasure of the identity Camilla had spent years building. These weren't just events, they were the platforms through which she had connected with the public, demonstrated her commitment to causes she genuinely cared about, and proven her value to the institution she had married into. "What reason are they giving?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with having to deliver such news. The official explanation is that they want to provide opportunities for the younger generation to take on more prominent roles. They're framing it as a natural evolution of responsibilities as Prince William prepares for his eventual succession. The phrase natural evolution stung particularly deeply. There was nothing natural about the systematic dismantling of her carefully constructed role within the family. This was deliberate, calculated, and, surprisingly swift. Someone had decided that Camilla's time in the spotlight needed to come to an end, and they were wasting no time in implementing that decision. "And my staff?" Camilla inquired, dreading the answer but needing to know the full extent of the changes. Margaret's expression grew even more pained. "Several of your key advisors have been offered positions within Prince William's expanded office. The palace has made it clear that these are excellent opportunities for career advancement. 3 have already accepted transfers, and 2 more are considering it." The betrayal of it cut deep. These were people she had mentored, trusted, and worked alongside for years. The fact that they were being offered better positions elsewhere wasn't their fault, but it still felt like abandonment. In the ruthless world of palace politics, loyalty often took a back seat to career advancement. Camilla rose from her chair and walked to the tall window that overlooked the castle gardens. The autumn leaves were turning golden and red, a beautiful display of nature's own transition. But, unlike the trees, which would bloom again in spring, she wasn't sure if her influence within the royal family would ever recover from this dramatic pruning. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly from behind her. "I've heard rumors from contacts in the communications office that there's going to be a major announcement next week about Prince William taking on additional constitutional responsibilities. They're calling it a modernization initiative, but the practical effect will be to position him as the primary working royal under His Majesty." The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't just about reassigning a few events or reshuffling staff. This was a comprehensive restructuring designed to elevate William's profile while systematically reducing everyone else's influence. Camilla was simply the most obvious casualty in a broader strategic shift. As she stood at the window, watching gardeners tend to the meticulously maintained grounds below, Camilla reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered the early days of her relationship with Charles, when they had been forced to conduct their romance in secret. She thought about the years of public vilification that followed Diana's death, when she was portrayed as the other woman who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage. She recalled the gradual acceptance that came with time and careful public relations, the slow building of respect through dedicated service and genuine commitment to charitable causes. All of that history now seemed to be counting for nothing in the face of institutional priorities. The monarchy was always thinking decades ahead, and, apparently, those future plans didn't include a prominent role for her. The realization was both heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret announced that King Charles's private secretary was requesting a meeting later that afternoon. The timing seemed too coincidental to be casual. Clearly, the palace wanted to discuss these changes with her directly, probably to ensure she understood her new, diminished role and would accept it gracefully. Camilla turned back to face Margaret, her expression carefully composed despite the turmoil she felt inside. Years of royal training had taught her to hide her emotions, to present a serene facade regardless of the circumstances. But Margaret, who had worked with her long enough to read the subtle signs, could see the pain and frustration that Camilla was working so hard to conceal. "What would you like me to tell them about the meeting?" Margaret asked. "Tell them I'll be available," Camilla replied, her voice steady despite everything. "And, Margaret, I want you to prepare a comprehensive review of all my current charitable commitments and patronages. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." As Margaret gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Camilla added quietly, "Also, could you arrange for me to have tea with some of the staff who are considering transfers? I want to speak with them personally before they make their final decisions." After Margaret left, Camilla returned to her desk and picked up the letter that had started this devastating morning. Reading it again, she noticed details she had missed in her initial shock. The language was carefully crafted to sound supportive and collaborative, but the underlying message was unmistakable: step aside gracefully, or be pushed aside less gently. The afternoon sun was beginning to stream through her windows as Camilla considered her options. She could accept this marginalization quietly, retreating into the background and focusing on the smaller charitable work that would likely remain in her portfolio. Or she could fight back, using her connections and influence to resist this systematic dismantling of her role. But she knew that fighting too hard would only confirm the narrative that she was difficult to work with, selfish in her ambitions, and ultimately a liability to the institution. The sound of her phone ringing broke through her contemplation. The caller ID showed it was her son Tom, checking in as he often did. For a moment, she considered answering, wanting the comfort of family connection in this difficult moment. But she couldn't bring herself to explain what was happening, not yet. The humiliation felt too fresh, too raw to share even with those closest to her. Instead, she let the call go to voicemail and returned to staring out at the gardens. Somewhere in those same grounds, Prince William was probably meeting with his advisors, planning his expanded role and discussing strategies for his increased responsibilities. The irony of their proximity, him ascending while she descended, wasn't lost on her. As evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the castle grounds, Camilla finally allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. Tears she had been holding back all day finally spilled over, and, for just a few minutes, she grieved for the position she was losing, the respect that was being taken away, and the future that suddenly looked so much smaller than she had imagined. But even as she mourned, part of her mind was already working on what came next. She had survived scandal, public hatred, and institutional resistance before. She had carved out a place for herself in one of the world's most traditional and change-resistant institutions. This setback, devastating as it felt, might not be the end of her story. It might simply be the beginning of a new chapter, one that required different strategies and different approaches to influence and relevance. The meeting with the King's secretary tomorrow would tell her much about how complete this marginalization was intended to be. Until then, she would grieve privately for what she was losing, and then she would begin planning for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing that decades of royal life had taught her, it was that survival required adaptation, and adaptation required both strength and cunning in equal measure. The following morning arrived with an unexpected chill that seemed to penetrate the very stones of Windsor Castle. Camilla had barely slept, her mind racing through various scenarios and potential responses to the systematic dismantling of her royal role. She dressed with particular care that day, choosing a navy blue suit that projected both authority and dignity. If she was going to face whatever came next, she would do so looking every inch the royal she had fought so hard to become. The meeting with Sir Christopher Weatherby, King Charles's principal private secretary, was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the blue drawing room. As Camilla made her way through the castle's familiar corridors, she noticed subtle changes that she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. Portraits of Prince William and Princess Catherine seemed more prominently displayed, while photographs that had included her prominently were either missing or relocated to less visible positions. Staff members she encountered in the hallways offered their usual respectful greetings, but something in their demeanor had shifted. There was a carefulness in their interactions, as if they were unsure of her standing and didn't want to appear too familiar or too distant. Palace staff had an almost supernatural ability to sense political winds, and, apparently, the message about her diminished status had already filtered down through the complex hierarchy of royal household management. Sir Christopher was waiting for her in the blue drawing room, a man in his early 60s whose silver hair and impeccable tailoring couldn't hide the uncomfortable nature of his mission. He had served the royal family for over 20 years and had witnessed numerous internal power shifts, but this particular conversation was clearly one he would have preferred to avoid. "Your Royal Highness," he said, rising to greet her with the formal bow that protocol demanded. "Thank you for making time for this meeting. I trust you received the correspondence regarding the upcoming restructuring of royal duties?" Camilla settled into one of the room's elegant chairs, her posture perfectly straight despite the exhaustion she felt. "I did indeed receive the letter, Sir Christopher. I must say, the extent of the changes was quite surprising, given that there had been no prior discussion about such a comprehensive reorganization." Sir Christopher's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Camilla could see the slight tension around his eyes that suggested he was as uncomfortable with this situation as she was. The king felt it was important to implement these changes efficiently to avoid prolonged uncertainty. Prince William's growing popularity and his preparation for eventual succession make this an opportune time for expanded responsibilities. The careful language didn't disguise the central message: William was being elevated, and everyone else needed to step aside to make room for his ascendancy. But what struck Camilla most forcefully was the absence of any mention of her contributions, her years of service, or even basic consultation about how these changes might affect her ongoing commitments. "I understand the importance of preparing Prince William for his future role," Camilla replied carefully. "However, I'm concerned about the abrupt nature of these changes and their impact on various charitable organizations and initiatives that depend on royal patronage for their effectiveness and fundraising efforts." Sir Christopher consulted a leather folder that sat on the small table beside his chair. "Actually, that's one of the items I wanted to discuss with you. The palace has conducted a comprehensive review of all royal patronages and charitable commitments. We've identified opportunities for consolidation and more strategic allocation of royal support." He handed her a thick document that outlined proposed changes to her charitable portfolio. As Camilla scanned the pages, her heart sank with each item. The Cancer Research Foundation, which she had supported for 5 years and had helped raise millions of pounds, transferred to Princess Catherine. The Literacy Trust, where she had personally visited dozens of schools and libraries, reassigned to the Earl of Wessex. The Military Wives Association, an organization particularly close to her heart, moved to Princess Anne's already extensive portfolio. "This is more than consolidation," Camilla observed, her voice remaining steady despite her growing anger. "This appears to be a complete dismantling of my charitable work. These organizations aren't just names on a list, they're causes I've personally championed, relationships I've built over years, initiatives that have succeeded because of sustained commitment." Sir Christopher shifted slightly in his chair, clearly anticipating this response but still uncomfortable with having to deliver it. "The decision was made that your charitable work would benefit from a more focused approach. You would retain patronage of several heritage and arts organizations, particularly those dealing with literary preservation and architectural conservation. These align well with your personal interests and background." The subtext was clear: she was being relegated to safe, politically neutral causes that couldn't compete with the high-profile, media-friendly charities that would now be associated with other members of the family. Heritage and arts organizations, while important, didn't offer the same opportunities for public engagement or media coverage that came with healthcare, education, or military support initiatives. "And what about my role in state functions?" Camilla inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sir Christopher's expression became even more careful. "Your participation in state functions will continue, naturally. However, the primary hosting duties for major diplomatic events will increasingly fall to Prince William and Princess Catherine. This reflects their growing importance in international relations and provides them with essential experience in statecraft." Each explanation felt like another small humiliation, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. Camilla was being systematically excluded from every aspect of royal life that carried real influence or prestige. She would still appear at events, but as a supporting player rather than a central figure. "May I ask whose decision this was?" she said, her carefully maintained composure beginning to show hairline cracks. Sir Christopher paused for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. The restructuring was developed through consultation between His Majesty's office and Prince William's advisory team. The details were finalized after extensive discussion about the future direction of the monarchy and how best to serve the institution's long-term interests. The phrase consultation between His Majesty's office and Prince William's advisory team spoke volumes. Notably absent from that consultation was any mention of discussion with her, despite the fact that these changes would fundamentally alter her life and work. The decision had been made about her, not with her. "I see," Camilla said quietly. "And when will these changes be implemented?" "The transition will begin immediately with the charitable patronage transfers. The formal announcement about Prince William's expanded constitutional role will be made next week during the state opening of Parliament. Media briefings will emphasize the positive aspects of modernization and preparation for the future." The media strategy was already in place, Camilla realized. This wasn't a decision that was still being debated or refined, it was a complete reorganization that had been planned for weeks or possibly months. She had been kept in the dark until the very last moment, presented with a fait accompli disguised as a consultation. As Sir Christopher continued outlining the timeline and implementation details, Camilla found herself thinking about her husband, King Charles. Where was he in all of this? Was this restructuring something he had initiated, reluctantly agreed to, or simply been pressured into accepting by advisors who felt it was necessary for the monarchy's future? The relationship between Charles and William had always been complex, marked by the usual tensions between a reigning monarch and his heir, but complicated by their shared experience of Diana's death and the very public struggles of Charles's path to the throne. Now it seemed that those advisors surrounding both men had determined that William's popularity and modern appeal needed to be maximized, even if it meant systematically diminishing other family members. "There is one more matter," Sir Christopher said, his tone becoming even more formal. "The palace would appreciate your cooperation in presenting these changes positively to the media. Any suggestion of internal conflict or dissatisfaction would be harmful to the institution as a whole." Here was the implicit threat, delivered with diplomatic politeness but unmistakable in its meaning. She was expected to smile, accept her diminished role gracefully, and help sell the narrative that this was all a wonderful modernization effort rather than a calculated political maneuver. "Of course," Camilla replied, matching his formal tone. "I've always been committed to supporting the institution, regardless of my personal role within it." As the meeting concluded and Sir Christopher gathered his papers, Camilla remained seated, processing everything she had heard. The scope of her marginalization was even more comprehensive than she had initially realized from the letter. This wasn't just about reassigning a few events, it was about fundamentally altering her position within the family hierarchy. After Sir Christopher left, Camilla remained alone in the blue drawing room, surrounded by centuries of royal history. The portraits on the walls depicted kings and queens who had navigated their own political challenges, family rivalries, and institutional pressures. Some had triumphed, others had been forgotten or marginalized by history. The question now was which category she would fall into. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, reminding her about lunch with Lady Patricia Mountbatten, one of the few people within royal circles who had become a genuine friend rather than just a professional ally. Patricia had lived through decades of royal politics and had seen numerous family members rise and fall in prominence. Her perspective might provide valuable insight into how to navigate this crisis. As Camilla made her way to the private dining room where lunch was being served, she encountered several staff members who had worked with her for years. Their greetings seemed more subdued than usual, and she wondered how much they knew about the changes that were coming. Palace staff were notorious gossips, and news of major reorganizations rarely stayed secret for long within the closely connected community that served the royal household. Lady Patricia was already seated when Camilla arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled and her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of Camilla's appearance and demeanor. At 87, Patricia had lived through more royal dramas than almost anyone alive, and she had developed an uncanny ability to read the political temperature of the family. "My dear," Patricia said as they were served a light lunch of salmon and salad, "you look as though you've been given some rather unpleasant news." "What's happened?" Camilla found herself grateful for Patricia's directness. In a world where most conversations were conducted through layers of diplomatic language and careful euphemisms, Patricia's straightforward approach was refreshing. "It seems that my role within the family is being significantly revised," Camilla said carefully, still conscious that even private conversations within palace walls could have public consequences. Patricia raised an eyebrow and set down her fork. "Revised how? And on whose authority?" Over the course of their lunch, Camilla outlined the morning's meeting and the comprehensive nature of the changes being implemented. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grim as the full scope of the reorganization became clear. "This is more systematic than anything I've seen in decades," Patricia observed when Camilla finished. "Usually these adjustments happen gradually, with some attempt to maintain dignity for all parties involved. What you're describing sounds like a deliberate campaign to marginalize you completely." The bluntness of Patricia's assessment was both validating and terrifying. If someone with Patricia's experience viewed the situation as unusually harsh, then Camilla wasn't overreacting to what was happening to her. "The question," Patricia continued, "is whether this is coming primarily from Charles's advisors, William's team, or both working together. That would determine your options for response." The possibility that her own husband might be driving her marginalization was almost too painful to consider directly. But the reality of royal marriages, particularly at the highest levels, was that institutional considerations often trumped personal loyalty. Charles had waited decades to become king, and if his advisors convinced him that supporting William's elevation required reducing her prominence, he might feel he had little choice. "What would you do?" Camilla asked quietly. Patricia was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. "In the old days, I might have suggested fighting back more directly. But the modern monarchy operates under different pressures. The media scrutiny is relentless, public opinion shifts rapidly, and the institution's survival depends on maintaining popularity with younger generations." She paused, taking a sip of her tea before continuing. "William represents the future, and he's genuinely popular in ways that the older generation struggles to match. The advisors aren't wrong that elevating him makes strategic sense for the monarchy's long-term survival. But," Patricia added, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "the way they're implementing this is unnecessarily cruel and short-sighted. Completely marginalizing you creates unnecessary drama and sends a message that loyalty and service can be discarded when they become inconvenient." As their lunch concluded, Patricia offered one final piece of advice: don't make any immediate decisions about how to respond. Take time to understand the full situation, including what role Charles is really playing in all of this. Sometimes the best response to a political attack is patient strategic thinking rather than immediate reaction. Walking back to her private study after lunch, Camilla reflected on Patricia's words. The older woman was right that hasty responses often made difficult situations worse. But the systematic nature of what was happening to her required some kind of strategic response, even if that response needed to be carefully planned and executed. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the castle grounds, Camilla realized that her immediate priority needed to be understanding the full scope of what she was facing. The morning's meeting had revealed the official changes, but the real political dynamics driving those changes remained unclear. Before she could plan any response, she needed to understand who was really behind this reorganization and what their ultimate objectives might be. The next few days would be crucial for gathering information and assessing her options. She had survived previous crises through careful strategy and patient persistence. This challenge might be the most serious she had faced, but it wasn't necessarily insurmountable. The key would be understanding the true nature of what she was up against and responding accordingly. 3 days after her devastating meeting with Sir Christopher, Camilla found herself in an unexpected position, conducting her own investigation into the palace politics that had so suddenly turned against her. What had begun as hurt and confusion was crystallizing into a determined effort to understand the forces at work and, if possible, to find some way to push back against her systematic marginalization. Her first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. James Morrison, a junior press secretary who had worked in her communications office for 2 years, requested a private meeting. James was ambitious, intelligent, and exactly the sort of young professional who typically would have jumped at the chance to transfer to Prince William's expanding team. Instead, he had declined the offer and asked to speak with Camilla directly. They met in her private sitting room at Clarence House, away from the formal atmosphere of Windsor and the ears that seemed to be everywhere these days. James arrived looking nervous but determined, carrying a leather portfolio that he clutched tightly as he settled into the chair across from her. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I wanted you to know about some conversations I've overheard that might be relevant to the recent changes in your duties." Camilla felt a spark of hope mixed with apprehension. Information was power in palace politics, but the source and accuracy of that information could be just as important as its content. "Please, speak freely," she encouraged him. James opened his portfolio and consulted what appeared to be handwritten notes. 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting between Prince William's private secretary, David Hamilton, and Sir Christopher. I was delivering documents to Sir Christopher's office when I heard them discussing what they called the Camilla situation. The phrase stung, but Camilla maintained her composure. "What exactly did they say?" "Mr. Hamilton was arguing that your continued prominence in charitable work was creating what he called brand confusion for Prince William. He said that having multiple family members associated with similar causes was diluting the impact of royal patronage and confusing the public about who represented what." This was more concrete information than anything Camilla had received from official sources. The idea that her charitable work was being viewed as competition for William's brand rather than as complementary royal service revealed the calculating nature of the forces working against her. "There was more," James continued, consulting his notes again. "They specifically discussed your work with cancer research organizations. Mr. Hamilton said that Princess Catherine's connection to cancer charities would be more emotionally resonant with the public because of her youth and her role as a mother. He suggested that your involvement was actually hindering fundraising efforts because donors preferred to associate with her instead." The clinical calculation behind these decisions was breathtaking. Her years of dedicated work, the relationships she had built with patients and families, the genuine expertise she had developed in cancer advocacy, all of this was being dismissed because focus groups and polling data suggested that a younger, more traditionally beautiful princess would be more effective at attracting donations. "Did you hear anything about His Majesty's role in these decisions?" Camilla asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to reveal. Sir Christopher mentioned that the king had initially expressed some concerns about the pace of changes. But Mr. Hamilton apparently provided polling data showing Prince William's approval ratings compared to other family members. After reviewing those numbers, His Majesty agreed that accelerating Prince William's prominence was necessary for the monarchy's future. So Charles knew exactly what was happening to her, had initially tried to slow it down, but had ultimately been convinced by data and advisors that sacrificing her position was necessary for the institution's survival. The personal betrayal of that knowledge hit harder than all the professional setbacks combined. "Thank you for bringing this to me," Camilla said quietly. "May I ask why you're sharing this information?" James looked directly at her for the first time during their conversation. "Because I've watched you work for 2 years. I've seen you visit cancer wards where you spent hours with patients, not for photo opportunities but because you genuinely cared. I've seen you study policy briefs until midnight because you wanted to understand complex issues before speaking about them. What's happening to you isn't just unfair, it's wasteful of real talent and dedication. His words provided some comfort, but they also highlighted how isolated she had become within the broader palace structure. A junior press secretary was the only person willing to provide her with honest information about the political forces working against her. After James left, Camilla spent the afternoon processing what she had learned. The systematic nature of her marginalization was now clear. It wasn't personal animosity or random bureaucratic reshuffling. It was a carefully planned strategy based on polling data, brand management principles, and cold calculations about public relations effectiveness. That evening, she finally decided to confront Charles directly. She couldn't continue navigating this crisis without understanding his role in it and his true feelings about what was happening to her. Their marriage had survived public scandals, family opposition, and institutional pressure, but this situation was testing it in ways that previous challenges hadn't. Charles was in his study at Clarence House when she knocked on the door. He looked up from a stack of official papers, and she could see the weariness in his eyes. Being king was taking a visible toll on him, aging him in ways that his years as heir apparent hadn't quite managed. "We need to talk," she said simply, closing the door behind her. Charles set down his pen and gestured for her to join him on the small sofa near the fireplace. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken knowledge hanging between them. "You know why I'm here," Camilla began. Charles sighed deeply, suddenly, looking every one of his 76 years. "I know this has been difficult for you. The changes weren't implemented in the way I would have preferred. But you did approve them," she pressed. "You agreed to systematically dismantling my role within the family." Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace where a small fire crackled softly. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that surprised her. "The monarchy is facing challenges that I never anticipated when I was preparing to be king. Public support has to be constantly earned and re-earned. The younger generation expects different things from royal institutions. William represents hope for the future in ways that we don't." The "we" included her, and they both understood that. At 76 and 77 respectively, they were increasingly seen as representatives of the past rather than the future. "I've spent my entire adult life serving this institution," Camilla said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I've endured public hatred, media attacks, and family rejection, all for the sake of supporting you and the monarchy. And now I'm being told that my service is actually harmful to the institution I've sacrificed so much for?" Charles reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The gesture felt hollow given what she now knew about his role in her marginalization. The advisors presented data showing that William's approval ratings are significantly higher than any other family member, Charles said quietly. They argued that consolidating public attention around him and Catherine would strengthen the monarchy's position with younger demographics. The polling was quite convincing. "And my feelings about this? My work, my commitments, my relationships with the organizations I've supported for years? None of that factored into these calculations?" Charles looked directly at her for the first time during their conversation. "Of course your feelings matter to me personally. But, as king, I have to make decisions based on what's best for the institution, even when those decisions cause personal pain." There it was, the central tension that had probably driven many royal marriages to breaking points throughout history. The institution's needs would always take precedence over personal relationships, even between husband and wife. "So what happens now?" Camilla asked. "I continue to appear at ribbon cuttings and art gallery openings while watching from the sidelines as William and Catherine take over everything I've worked to build." Charles was silent for several minutes, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties and responsibilities. Finally, he spoke with what seemed like genuine regret. "The formal announcement about William's expanded role will be made next week. After that, there may be opportunities to find new ways for you to contribute meaningfully. The current changes don't have to be permanent if circumstances shift. But they both knew that circumstances rarely shifted in favor of older royals whose popularity had peaked. Once the institutional machinery committed to a particular direction, reversing course became nearly impossible. "I see," Camilla said, standing to leave. "Thank you for your honesty, at least." As she reached the door, Charles called after her. "Camilla, I hope you understand that this isn't what I wanted. If I could find another way to modernize the monarchy without these changes, I would." She paused at the door but didn't turn around. "The tragedy is that I actually do understand. But understanding doesn't make it hurt any less." Back in her own sitting room, Camilla poured herself a glass of wine and tried to process the emotional complexity of what Charles had revealed. He genuinely regretted what was happening to her, but he was still allowing it to happen because his advisors had convinced him it was necessary. The institutional pressures on him were real, but so was the personal betrayal she felt. Her phone buzzed with a text from her son Tom, asking if she wanted to have dinner later in the week. For the first time since this crisis began, she considered accepting. The royal bubble she lived in had isolated her from normal human relationships and perspective. Maybe it was time to seek comfort and advice from family members who weren't constrained by institutional loyalty and political calculations. As she sat in her comfortable chair, sipping wine and watching the lights of London twinkle in the darkness beyond her windows, Camilla began to realize that her options were more limited than she had hoped, but perhaps not as bleak as they had initially seemed. She couldn't fight the institutional forces that were elevating William; that battle was already lost. But she might be able to find ways to maintain dignity and some measure of influence, even within the constraints that were being imposed on her. The key would be understanding that she was now playing a different game with different rules. The old strategies that had helped her gain acceptance and build her position wouldn't work in this new environment. She needed to develop new approaches that acknowledged the realities of her diminished formal role while finding alternative ways to remain relevant and respected. Tomorrow, she would begin exploring what those new approaches might look like. Tonight, she would allow herself to grieve for what she was losing and prepare mentally for the challenging period ahead. The battle for her position within the royal hierarchy might be over, but the war for her long-term legacy and influence was just beginning. The week following Charles's painful confession proved to be a turning point for Camilla, though not in ways she had anticipated. The formal announcement of Prince William's expanded constitutional role dominated headlines exactly as the palace communications team had planned. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, praising the monarchy's forward-thinking approach and William's readiness to take on greater responsibilities. Buried deep in the coverage were brief mentions of streamlined royal duties and more focused charitable portfolios for other family members, euphemisms that barely disguised the systematic reduction of her role. What caught Camilla off guard was the public reaction. While the official media coverage followed the palace's preferred narrative, social media and online commentary revealed a more complex response. Many royal watchers had noticed the sudden absence of her name from major events and charitable announcements. Several prominent royal correspondents began asking pointed questions about why someone who had built such an effective charitable platform was suddenly disappearing from high-profile engagements. The first sign that her marginalization might not go as smoothly as planned came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the director of the Cancer Research Foundation that had been transferred from Camilla's patronage to Catherine's, requested a private meeting. They met at a small cafe in Notting Hill, far from the usual royal venues, both women wearing dark glasses and understated clothing to avoid recognition. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Mitchell began, her voice carrying barely controlled anger, "I wanted you to know that our board is extremely concerned about the recent changes in patronage. We weren't consulted about this transfer, and, frankly, it feels like a betrayal of the relationship we've built with you over 5 years." Camilla was surprised by the directness of Dr. Mitchell's complaint. Royal patronages were usually treated as gifts that organizations gratefully accepted regardless of which family member provided them. "We've received preliminary communications from Princess Catherine's office," Dr. Mitchell continued, "and it's clear that they want to reshape our public messaging and event planning to align with her existing commitments. Essentially, they want us to become a subsidiary part of a larger charitable brand rather than maintaining our independent identity and mission focus." This was information that illuminated the broader strategy behind her marginalization. It wasn't just about reassigning patronages, it was about consolidating charitable work under umbrella brands that could be more effectively controlled and marketed by the palace communications team. "What's most concerning," Dr. Mitchell said, lowering her voice, "is that we've been told to minimize references to the work you've done with us over the past 5 years. They want a clean slate that doesn't reference previous royal involvement. It's as if they're trying to erase your contributions entirely." The systematic nature of this erasure was breathtaking. Not only was she being removed from current responsibilities, but her past work was being actively minimized to create cleaner narratives for the family members who were replacing her. "Dr. Mitchell," Camilla said carefully, "what would you prefer to do if you had complete freedom to choose?" The doctor didn't hesitate. "We'd prefer to continue working with you. Your understanding of our mission, your relationships with patients and families, your genuine expertise in cancer policy, these can't be easily replaced. Princess Catherine is lovely and well-intentioned, but she doesn't have the background or the personal investment that you've developed." Here was something Camilla hadn't anticipated. The organizations themselves might resist the patronage transfers if given the option. The palace had apparently assumed that charitable organizations would gratefully accept whatever royal patron was assigned to them, without considering that some had developed genuinely meaningful relationships with their current patrons. "Of course, we can't openly oppose palace decisions," Dr. Mitchell continued. "But we can be selective about how enthusiastically we embrace changes that we believe will harm our mission effectiveness." The meeting with Dr. Mitchell planted the seeds of a new strategy in Camilla's mind. If the formal royal structure was being reorganized to exclude her, perhaps there were informal ways to maintain influence and relationships that the palace couldn't easily control. That afternoon, she made a series of phone calls to directors and chairs of organizations that had been part of her charitable portfolio. The conversations were carefully framed as courtesy calls to ensure smooth transitions, but they allowed her to gauge how these organizations really felt about the changes being imposed on them. The pattern that emerged was striking. Larger, more established charities seemed resigned to accepting whatever royal patron was assigned to them, viewing any royal connection as beneficial regardless of the specific individual involved. But smaller, more specialized organizations that had developed genuine working relationships with her were much more resistant to change. The Military Wives Association was particularly vocal in their disappointment. Colonel Janet Thompson, the organization's chair, was blunt in her assessment during their phone conversation. "Your Royal Highness, with all due respect to Princess Anne, we've worked with you for 3 years to develop programs specifically tailored to the unique challenges that military families face today. You've visited our support centers, met with hundreds of wives individually, and helped us develop policy recommendations that are now being implemented across the military. Starting over with someone new, regardless of their qualifications, means losing institutional knowledge and personal relationships that took years to build." Similar sentiments came from the Literacy Trust, the Adult Learning Alliance, and several smaller organizations that had been part of her portfolio. A picture was emerging of institutional resistance to the patronage transfers, resistance that the palace apparently hadn't anticipated when planning this reorganization. More importantly, these conversations revealed that her years of genuine engagement with these causes had created a network of professional and personal relationships that couldn't simply be transferred to another family member by bureaucratic fiat. Real influence, it seemed, wasn't just about formal titles and official duties, it was about trust, expertise, and authentic commitment that had to be earned over time. This realization led to a conversation with Margaret that would prove crucial to Camilla's strategic thinking. Her private secretary had spent the past week conducting her own research into how other marginalized royals had maintained influence and relevance despite being sidelined by the formal power structure. "I've been studying the example of Princess Margaret," Margaret reported during their meeting. Obviously, her situation was different because she was never married to a king, but she faced similar challenges when she was systematically excluded from major royal duties in favor of other family members. Princess Margaret's approach had been to maintain a parallel sphere of influence through cultural organizations, social connections, and charitable work that operated somewhat independently of the formal royal structure. While she couldn't compete with the Queen or other senior royals for constitutional responsibilities, she had carved out a niche in arts patronage and social causes that allowed her to remain relevant and respected. The key, Margaret observed, was that she focused on areas where her personal interests and genuine expertise could create value that others couldn't easily replicate. She didn't try to compete directly with more senior royals, she found different ways to contribute. This historical example offered a potential roadmap for Camilla's response to her own marginalization. Rather than fighting futilely for the high-profile charitable work that was being transferred to William and Catherine, she could potentially develop a different kind of influence based on her unique background and interests. What would that look like practically? Camilla asked. Margaret had clearly given this considerable thought. Your background in publishing and your genuine love of literature could be the foundation for a literary and educational focus that no other family member could match. Your experience with media scrutiny and public criticism gives you credibility with organizations that work with people facing similar challenges. Your age and life experience allow you to connect with demographic groups that younger royals might struggle to reach effectively. The idea was intriguing but would require careful implementation. Any attempt to create an alternative power base would need to appear supportive of the broader royal family rather than competitive with it. The palace could tolerate independent initiatives as long as they didn't threaten or overshadow the official priorities. That evening, Camilla had dinner with her son Tom at a private club in Mayfair. It was the first time since the crisis began that she had sought comfort and advice from family outside the royal structure. Tom, a successful food critic and author, had always maintained some distance from royal life while remaining supportive of his mother's marriage and public role. "You look terrible," he said with the brutal honesty that only family members can get away with. "What's really happening?" "The official announcements make everything sound positive, but you look like someone who's been through a war." For the first time in weeks, Camilla allowed herself to be completely honest about what she was experiencing. She outlined the systematic nature of her marginalization, the personal betrayal she felt from Charles, and the professional humiliation of watching her life's work being redistributed to others. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting her express the full scope of her frustration and pain. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes before responding. "It sounds like you're grieving," he said finally. "Grieving for the role you thought you had, the security you believed you possessed, and the partnership with Charles that you thought was stronger than institutional pressure." The observation was painfully accurate. She was grieving, and that grief was complicated by the fact that the losses weren't complete or final. She was still technically the queen consort, still married to the king, still expected to perform royal duties. But the substance of her role had been fundamentally altered in ways that might not be reversible. "So what do you do when you're grieving something that isn't completely dead?" Tom continued. "You find ways to honor what was valuable about what you've lost while building something new that serves your current reality." His perspective from outside the royal bubble was clarifying. The institutional thinking that dominated palace life made it difficult to see alternatives to the formal power structure. But influence and meaningful work could take many different forms, some of which might actually be more personally satisfying than the bureaucratic royal duties she was losing. "The question," Tom said as their dinner concluded, is what you actually want to accomplish with the rest of your life, independent of titles and official duties. What would make you feel like you were contributing something valuable to the world? It was a question she realized she hadn't asked herself in years. Her goals had been defined by her role within the royal family, her desire to support Charles, and her determination to prove herself worthy of acceptance by the institution. But what did she personally want to achieve? Walking back to Clarence's house after dinner, Camilla felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of possibility. The formal royal structure was being reorganized to exclude her, but the world beyond that structure offered opportunities for influence and contribution that she was only beginning to explore. The next morning, she would begin the process of reimagining her life and work within the constraints of her new reality. It wouldn't be the role she had envisioned or the partnership with Charles she had hoped for, but it might ultimately prove more personally fulfilling than anything she had experienced as a traditional senior royal. The key would be developing the courage to step away from fighting for what she was losing and, instead, investing energy in creating something entirely new. It was a terrifying prospect, but also an unexpectedly liberating one. For the first time in her adult life, she might have the opportunity to define success on her own terms rather than according to institutional expectations. 6 months after the devastating restructuring that had initially threatened to destroy everything Camilla had worked to build, she found herself in an unexpected position of quiet strength and renewed purpose. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy, but gradually she had discovered that her marginalization from the formal royal structure had paradoxically freed her to develop a more authentic and personally meaningful form of public service. The turning point had come 3 months earlier when she made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She would stop fighting for the charitable patronages that had been transferred to other family members and, instead, create entirely new initiatives that reflected her genuine interests and unique background. It was a risky strategy that required her to build influence from scratch, but it also allowed her to work without the constant oversight and political maneuvering that characterized traditional royal duties. Her first major independent initiative emerged from a conversation with Dr. Mitchell about the challenges facing cancer patients who were also dealing with financial hardship. Rather than trying to reclaim her role with the Cancer Research Foundation, Camilla had worked with Dr. Mitchell to establish an entirely new organization focused specifically on providing practical support for working-class families affected by cancer. The Cancer Family Support Network, as it came to be known, operated with deliberately minimal royal branding. Camilla served as founder and chair rather than patron, allowing her to be actively involved in program development and implementation rather than just appearing at fundraising events. The organization's grassroots approach and focus on practical assistance rather than research funding attracted support from donors who felt that existing cancer charities were too focused on high-profile medical advances rather than everyday human needs. What made the initiative particularly powerful was Camilla's decision to share her own family's experience with cancer during her father's illness decades earlier. In a carefully planned interview with a respected health journalist, she spoke openly about the financial strain, emotional exhaustion, and practical challenges that middle-class families faced when dealing with serious illness. Her willingness to discuss personal vulnerability rather than maintaining royal distance resonated with ordinary people in ways that traditional royal charity work rarely achieved. The interview, published in a Sunday newspaper magazine, generated more positive media coverage than she had received in years. Comments sections and social media responses were overwhelmingly supportive, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of how cancer had affected their families financially and emotionally. For the first time since the royal restructuring began, Camilla felt like she was connecting with people as a human being rather than as a ceremonial figure. The success of the Cancer Support Initiative gave her confidence to pursue other projects that reflected her personal interests and background. Working with Margaret, who had proven invaluable in developing these new approaches, Camilla launched a literacy program specifically designed for adults who had left school early or whose education had been disrupted by family circumstances. The Adult Reading Recovery Program, based in community centers and libraries across working-class areas of England offered small group tutoring and individual support for people who wanted to improve their reading skills but were intimidated by formal educational settings. Camilla's background in publishing and her genuine love of literature made her a credible advocate for the program, and her willingness to visit classes and work directly with students created authentic connections that traditional royal visits rarely generated. Perhaps most importantly, these initiatives operated largely outside the palace communications machinery. While Camilla kept Charles and the royal household informed of her activities, she didn't seek their approval or support for specific programs. This independence allowed her to respond quickly to emerging needs and opportunities without navigating the bureaucratic processes that slowed down traditional royal charitable work. The approach wasn't without risks. Palace advisors worried that independent royal initiatives could create confusion about official family positions or compete with formal royal patronages. There were subtle attempts to bring her new work under greater institutional control, but Camilla had learned to deflect these pressures politely while maintaining operational independence. Her relationship with Charles had also evolved in unexpected ways. The initial betrayal she felt about his role in her marginalization had gradually given way to a more complex understanding of the pressures he faced as king. Their marriage remained strong, but it was now based on a more realistic assessment of how institutional loyalties would always influence his decisions. Interestingly, Charles seemed to genuinely admire the work she was doing outside the formal royal structure. Free from the responsibility of defending her initiatives within palace politics, he could simply appreciate their effectiveness and authenticity. Their private conversations increasingly focused on the satisfaction she was finding in her new approach rather than the frustrations of navigating traditional royal duties. "You seem happier than you've been in years," he observed one evening as they shared a quiet dinner at Highgrove. "More yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense. The constant pressure to prove herself worthy of royal acceptance, to navigate complex family dynamics, and to balance competing institutional priorities had been exhausting in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Working on initiatives that reflected her genuine interests and values, with people who respected her contributions rather than her title, was deeply satisfying. The broader royal family's response to her new direction had been mixed but generally positive. William and Catherine were too focused on their expanding responsibilities to view her grassroots charitable work as competitive with their high-profile patronages. If anything, her lower public profile made their own prominence more comfortable for them. Princess Anne had been unexpectedly supportive, offering practical advice based on her own decades of experience with hands-on charitable work. "The secret," Anne told her during a private conversation, "is finding work that matters to you personally rather than work that looks impressive in media coverage. Real satisfaction comes from genuine contribution, not public recognition." The transformation of her public role had also affected her relationship with the media in interesting ways. Royal correspondents who had previously focused on her fashion choices, public appearances, and relationships with other family members gradually began covering her charitable work more substantively. Her willingness to discuss real issues and personal experiences rather than sticking to safe royal talking points made her a more interesting interview subject. A profile in the Times, published on her 78th birthday, described her as a senior royal who has found her authentic voice by stepping away from traditional expectations. The article highlighted her hands-on approach to charitable work, her willingness to address controversial topics like poverty and social inequality, and her transformation from a figure primarily known for her relationship with the king into someone respected for her independent contributions. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the people directly affected by her work. Letters and emails from cancer families who had received practical support, adults who had learned to read through her programs, and community leaders who had worked with her initiatives provided evidence that her new approach was creating real value in people's lives. One letter, from a 45-year-old woman who had learned to read through the Adult Reading Recovery Program, particularly moved her. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted you to know that being able to read bedtime stories to my grandchildren for the first time has changed my whole life. Thank you for seeing people like me and creating something that actually helps rather than just talking about helping." Reading such responses in her study at Clarence House, Camilla reflected on the journey that had brought her to this unexpected place. The royal restructuring that had initially felt like a devastating blow had ultimately forced her to discover forms of public service that were more personally meaningful and potentially more impactful than anything she had done within the traditional royal framework. She had learned that genuine influence didn't always require formal authority, that authentic connection with people was more valuable than ceremonial prominence, and that personal fulfillment could come from work that operated largely outside public recognition and media coverage. Looking ahead, Camilla saw opportunities to expand and deepen the initiatives she had developed. The Cancer Family Support Network was exploring partnerships with regional health authorities to integrate practical support services into official treatment programs. The literacy program was being adapted for use in other countries where adult illiteracy remained a significant challenge. Plans were developing for new initiatives focused on elderly isolation, domestic abuse support, and mental health resources for rural communities. More importantly, she had discovered a sustainable approach to public service that could continue regardless of further changes in royal protocol or family dynamics. By building relationships and expertise outside the formal royal structure, she had created a form of influence that couldn't be easily transferred to other family members or eliminated by institutional reorganization. As evenings settled over London and she prepared for another day of site visits and program meetings, Camilla felt a contentment that had been absent during her years of fighting for position within the royal hierarchy. She had found a way to serve that honored both her personal values and her public responsibilities, without requiring her to compromise her authenticity or compete for recognition within family politics. The systematic marginalization that had initially threatened to end her meaningful public role had instead led her to discover work that was more personally satisfying and potentially more lastingly significant than anything she might have accomplished within traditional royal constraints. It wasn't the outcome she had anticipated, but it was proving to be exactly what she needed to create a legacy based on genuine contribution rather than ceremonial prominence. In the quiet of her study, surrounded by letters from people whose lives had been touched by her work, Camilla finally understood that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from fighting for what we think we want, but from having the courage to build something entirely new when circumstances force us to reimagine our possibilities.